Everything started with an ordinary white envelope left on the kitchen table. For Mark and Allison Tate, it said in calligraphic script on the front. Too formal for a dinner invitation, but not enough for a special occasion. Allison picked up the envelope, examining it with interest. Something about this envelope already gave her a feeling that it held more than just words. "It's from Henry Whitmore," Mark said, appearing in the doorway. His voice was restrained, but his eyes betrayed worry. Allison noticed how he unconsciously rubbed his temples, a gesture she had long learned to recognize as a sign of tension. "Your boss?" she asked, turning to him. Henry Whitmore, a name spoken in their house with a hint of reverence and slight anxiety. Successful, charismatic, with a reputation for seeing through people. Allison had never met him, but she knew more about him than she wanted to. Mark talked about him often, but always avoided deep details, as if afraid that even discussing Henry could bring unwanted consequences. "He invited us to dinner this Friday, just the two of us," Mark added, wiping his palms on his pants. Allison frowned. "That's strange. Usually such things are done with colleagues and their families or—" "I know," Mark interrupted, "but it's just us. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe he wants to get to know you, understand who's behind my work." He smiled, but his smile was unconvincing. Allison felt a chill in the air, as if behind the invitation lurked an invisible hand already reaching into their lives. Friday came faster than expected. Allison chose a simple yet elegant dress for the evening. "Nothing extra," she told herself, looking in the mirror. But the strange feeling did not leave her, as if this night would be something more than just dinner. Mark nervously fidgeted with his tie as they stopped in front of Henry's house. Huge, with panoramic windows, it looked more like an art gallery than a place to live. The light from inside shone through the glass, illuminating the driveway, as if the house itself was inviting them in, promising something extraordinary. "Are you ready?" Mark asked, not taking his eyes off the door. Allison nodded, feeling her heart begin to beat faster. She didn't know what awaited her behind those doors, but somehow she felt that this night would change everything. The door opened even before Allison could knock. Henry Whitmore stood in the doorway, tall, with perfect posture, his silver hair neatly combed back. His eyes, icy blue, like morning ice, studied them both with an almost imperceptible smile. "Mark, Allison," his voice was deep and melodic. "Welcome. Come in." He stepped aside, letting them in, and Allison felt her fingers unconsciously squeeze Mark's hand. Henry's house was even more impressive inside than outside. In the high hallway hung a huge abstract painting, done in bloody red and black tones, which drew the eye like a magnet. "Evelyn regrets that she can't join us today," Henry said, walking ahead, his steps almost soundless on the perfectly polished floor. "She's stuck in a meeting, and knowing her, the evening will last until midnight." "That's too bad," Allison said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Her absence is only our gain." Henry turned around, his smile on the verge between friendly and predatory. "Now I can focus on the two most interesting people of the evening." Allison felt Mark tense slightly beside her. "Henry, thank you for the invitation. This is very generous of you," Mark began, but Henry raised his hand, stopping him. "Mark, leave the formalities. This evening is an opportunity to relax. Work is work, but I am much more interested in getting to know the people I work with, especially those who influence them." He looked directly at Allison, and she was overcome by a strange feeling, as if he had just read her thoughts. They went into the living room, where the soft light from the fireplace reflected off the glass surfaces. On the coffee table stood 2 glasses of red wine and a massive bottle, already open. You must be tired after a long day. Wine will help you relax, Henry said, handing a glass to Allison. Thank you, she replied, taking the drink and trying not to meet his gaze. So, Henry continued, sitting down opposite. Tell me how you met. Mark smiled, his tension easing for a moment. We met at university, at a party. Allison accidentally spilled beer on me. Not accidentally, Allison quickly added with a smile. You were too self-assured, and I decided to humble you a bit. Henry chuckled softly. So you already understood that Mark needed guidance. It's amazing how this is preserved in marriage. Mark coughed, trying to hide his embarrassment. Allison is my best friend and toughest critic. She knows me better than anyone. That's obvious. Henry leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on Allison a little longer than was comfortable. I've long noticed that successful people always surround themselves with the right partners. Allison, you must be an incredibly patient woman to endure all the hardships associated with Mark's career. Patience isn't quite the word, she said, taking a sip of wine. It's more like I've learned to accept his dedication to work. And support him in it, Henry added, his voice softening. That's rare. Most people prefer to compete for attention. Allison felt her cheeks begin to burn. She looked at Mark, hoping he would change the subject, but he just sat silently, avoiding Henry's gaze. Henry, Mark finally said, trying to regain control of the conversation. Tell us about your family. Evelyn, I heard, is also fond of art? Yes, Henry nodded briefly. She's a connoisseur, not a creator, but her taste is impeccable. Most of the collection in this house is her doing, although some things here have a special meaning to me personally. He pointed to a massive sculpture in the corner of the room. Something about its sharp lines and twisted shapes made Allison feel inexplicably uneasy. That looks unusual, she said, trying to find the words. Exactly, like life. Henry smiled and raised his glass. To the unusual, it always leads us to the truth. Allison and Mark exchanged glances, but said nothing. It was clear that the dinner had only just begun, and with it, something they could not yet foresee. Allison couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unsettling about Henry's presence, his manner of speaking, his overly attentive gaze on her words. All of it made her feel uncomfortable, but there was something else, something intangible, as if he saw right through her. During dinner, Henry, as usual, kept the attention of his interlocutors in his hands. He talked about travels, about rare books, and about his first steps in business. His words sounded sincere, but Allison noticed subtle hints in his stories that seemed directed specifically at her. Allison, and what did you do before you became Mark's wife? Henry asked, suddenly shifting his attention to her. She averted her gaze to her wine glass, trying to maintain her composure. I was an editor at a small publishing house. I liked the work, but after the wedding, we decided that I would focus on the home. Did you decide, or did Mark? His question sounded innocent, but there was clearly a deeper meaning behind it. We decided together, she replied, feeling her throat tighten. Sometimes the sacrifices we make become the foundation of our future, but it's important not to forget who we really are. Henry raised his glass. To strength, both external and internal. Her eyes met his, and at that moment, she felt her walls begin to crumble. But why? Why did this man affect her so much? Mark left Allison and Henry alone again, apologizing to check urgent work messages. Henry did not speak immediately. He slowly poured wine into her glass, watching her with an expression that made her skin crawl. His presence became almost tangible, like an electric field. Have you ever felt like you're doing something you shouldn't? He finally said, leaning closer. His voice was soft, like a whisper, but there was power in it. It depends on the circumstances, Allison replied, trying not to let her voice tremble. She felt his gaze penetrating deeper than she allowed anyone before. Sometimes life gives us moments we can't ignore, he said, taking a step closer, narrowing the distance between them. Moments when everything that is right pales before what is true. Her mind screamed for her to stop, but her body seemed to obey a different impulse. Henry reached out, touching her face, and for a moment she froze. His touch was slow, almost careless, but there was a threat and a promise in it. When their lips met, Allison's world narrowed to one moment, one decision. It wasn't tender or romantic. It was raw, primal, and destructive. She tasted the wine on his lips, his breath mingling with hers. At that moment, she thought of nothing but how wrong it was and how much she wanted it. Their connection lasted only briefly, but it left something irreversible behind. When she pulled away, her mind was racing with thoughts. "This shouldn't have happened," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. "But it did," he said calmly, as if it were an inevitable outcome. "And you knew it." After the physical connection with Henry, Allison tried to maintain an appearance of calm, but inside her, a storm raged. The event was fleeting, but its consequences seemed to stretch into eternity. Mark suspected nothing, his trust in her unwavering, which made her guilt even heavier. Later that evening, Henry invited them into his office. He opened a massive safe, pulled out an old folder, and placed it on the table. "Important documents are kept here," he said, smiling slightly. "Each of these papers could change someone's life." Mark looked grimly at the folder. "And why are you showing us this?" "I just wanted to remind you how fragile our secrets can be." Henry looked at Allison with an expression that sent a chill down her spine. "We all keep secrets," he continued, not looking away, "but some of them are much more dangerous than others." Allison felt her heart pounding wildly. Was this a warning or a threat? Either way, she understood that Henry was not just a person. He was a puppet master, capable of manipulating the situation to his advantage. The fireplace had already burned down, leaving only a faint, flickering light in the room. Allison sat nervously in the chair, and Henry, as always, looked nonchalant. Mark, who had returned from the office where he had been talking on the phone, found them in this tense silence. His gaze immediately lingered on Allison, and she felt something heavy squeeze in her chest. "What were you talking about?" Mark asked, entering the room. Henry smiled like a predator who had just caught his prey. "We were discussing secrets," he said, reaching for his wine glass. "It seems there are plenty of them in your family." Mark frowned. "What secrets?" Allison opened her mouth to say something, but Henry spoke first. "Do you really think you know your wife, Mark?" His voice held more than just a question. "She is a charming woman, very multifaceted." "What are you trying to say?" Mark took a step forward, his voice firm. Henry looked at Allison. His icy blue eyes lingered on her face, and she felt goosebumps on her skin. He was deliberately playing on their nerves, like a master teasing his audience at the peak of tension. "I'm trying to say that sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us. Isn't that right, Allison?" Henry pronounced her name with an accent, as if he wanted to imbue it with a hidden meaning. "Stop it," Mark said sharply, his voice trembling with anger. "Stop your insinuations, Henry. What are you trying to achieve?" Henry calmly set his glass on the table and stood up. "Achieve? You're too serious, Mark. It's much simpler. Sometimes I just like to see people reveal their true selves." Allison stood up, feeling the situation was getting out of control. "Henry, I think it's time for us to go." But Henry ignored her words, moving toward Mark, his movements smooth, almost threatening. You know, Mark, there's always a choice in life. Sometimes it's simpler than it seems. For example, the choice between truth and illusion. What do you mean? Mark asked, clenching his fists. I mean that maybe your wife chose for you, Henry said, his gaze burning into Allison. And you didn't even notice. Mark lunged at him, but Allison stepped between them. Stop it, both of you. This has gone too far. But Henry continued, his voice low, almost hypnotic. Have you ever wondered why she looks at you like that? Why she sometimes seems distant to you? Or do you just prefer to close your eyes? Those words were the last straw. Mark, unable to contain himself, grabbed a massive bronze candlestick from the fireplace mantel and swung. Allison screamed, but it was too late. The blow sounded dull, as if the whole world paused for a moment. Henry staggered, his eyes wide with surprise, and he collapsed onto the table, sweeping away the glass and wine bottle. Red liquid spilled across the table, blending with the blood that began to slowly seep from the wound on his head. Mark stepped back, dropping the candlestick. He breathed heavily, his face deathly pale. I didn't mean to. Allison rushed to Henry, her hands trembling as she tried to find a pulse on his neck. Nothing. He's dead, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark groaned, clutching his head. What have we done? What have I done? Allison stood up, her mind racing. We have to do something. We can't just leave him here. Do you realize what we've done? This is murder. Mark looked at her in horror. It was self-defense. Her voice grew firmer. She stepped toward Mark, grabbing his shoulders. Do you hear me? It was self-defense. He provoked you. If we don't do everything right now, we'll lose everything. Mark shook his head. We should call the police. And what? Do you want to spend the rest of your life behind bars? Her voice was cold, almost icy. We'll do this together, right now. Her words sounded like an order, and Mark, though panicked, began to nod. What do you want to do? Allison looked at Henry's body. Her face was expressionless, like a mask. We have to get rid of the body, right now. Henry's body lay lifeless on the table. Red wine spread around him, as if intentionally emphasizing the bloody scene. The house was quiet, too quiet. Only the heavy breathing of Mark and Allison broke the dead silence. We can't leave him here, Allison said, her voice steady, but inside her, a storm raged. I can't do this. Mark shook his head, his hands trembling. This is wrong. This is murder. Allison stepped closer, her eyes flashing with cold determination. Listen to me, Mark. If we don't act now, this will destroy us both. You didn't want this, I know, but if they find us here, they won't listen to our explanations. They'll only see a dead man and you with this. She pointed to the candlestick lying on the floor. Mark pressed against the wall, his gaze wandering around the room like a cornered animal. What are you suggesting? Hide the body? Like in the movies? Don't you dare turn this into a joke, Allison said sharply. We need time to figure out what to do. First, we need to get him out of the house. Get rid of him? Where? His voice became sharp, almost hysterical. We don't even know what to do with this, with him. We'll find a way, she said coldly. Now, the main thing is to get rid of the evidence. She bent down and began examining the body. Henry was heavier than she expected, and the wine mixed with blood, soaked into his clothes, made it even harder. Mark still stood paralyzed against the wall. Help me, Mark, Allison screamed, unable to bear it. I can't do this alone. Mark slowly moved toward her, his movements awkward, as if he were resisting himself. Together, they lifted the body, trying not to look at each other. The silence of the house seemed oppressive, every step echoing with a hollow thud. "We can't leave any traces," Allison said, gasping from the effort. "You have to wipe everything, fingerprints, blood. We don't have much time." They carried Henry's body out through the back door, where a dark corridor led. Outside, it was deep night, only the faint light of street lamps illuminating the path. Allison glanced at Mark. His face was gray, like ash. "Where will we hide him?" Mark whispered, as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. "In the trunk," Allison replied, her voice as cold and hard as the night around them. "And then we'll figure it out." They carefully placed the body in the trunk of Henry's car, trying not to make any noise. Allison's heart was pounding wildly. She heard Mark breathing heavily, but she tried to focus. Now was not the time for weakness. When they returned to the house, Allison immediately began cleaning the blood from the floor, and Mark took care of the table. Everything reminded her of some nightmarish ritual. Each movement seemed endless. Time slowed down. Finally, when the room was cleaned, they sat down, breathing heavily. "What now?" Mark asked, his eyes darting from side to side. "We can't just leave everything like this." Allison looked up. In her eyes was a mixture of fatigue and determination. "We'll say he wasn't here. No one saw us arrive. Evelyn is not home, and Henry is missing." "That won't work," Mark whispered. "They'll find him. They always do." "We'll make it look like an accident," Allison said, her voice even softer, almost inaudible. "Somewhere out of town. The car went off a cliff or something else." Mark shook his head, his face contorted with fear. This is madness, Allison. We can't. "We have to," she interrupted, her voice trembling, but the determination in it was unshakable. "Do you understand that we have no other choice?" Later that night, when everything was done, they returned home, sitting silently in the car. Allison looked out the window, but her thoughts were far away. The events of the night seemed unreal to her, as if they had happened to someone else. But she knew this was just the beginning. Mark finally broke the silence. "Allison, I no longer know who you are." She turned her head, and in her eyes was a strange mixture of pain and emptiness. "I did it for us, Mark, so that we wouldn't be destroyed. And if you think this is you're wrong." He silently turned away, his face expressionless. Allison looked out the window again, her heart heavy with the weight of their new, inevitable future. Their world had been shattered, and she knew they would never be the same again.